In the humid air of Antioquia, a monument to a crime rusts in plain sight. It is an archway, stark and imposing, straddling a road that once led to the heart of an empire. Crowned atop it sits a replica of a small aircraft, its wings tilted as if in a perpetual silent flight. This was the gate, the first declaration of a power so absolute it felt no need for subtlety. The plane, a Piper PA-18 Super Cub, was not chosen for its beauty or rarity. Its significance was purely narrative. It was the vessel that carried the first shipment of cocaine, the seed from which a multi-billion-dollar enterprise would grow. To place it at the entrance was an act of supreme arrogance, a public consecration of the foundational sin. Today its paint, once a crisp white and blue, flakes away to reveal the corroding metal beneath. Vines snake around the support columns of the arch, a slow green reclamation by a jungle that outlasts all kingdoms. The symbol remains, but its meaning has shifted from a boast of power to an epitaph of hubris. The road that passes beneath it is no longer the exclusive domain of luxury vehicles, armored trucks, and motorcycles carrying young men with old eyes. Now it carries tourist buses and local families, visitors to a spectacle of ruin. The silence that surrounds the gate is different now. It is not the tense quiet of a fortress, but the hollow peace of a place whose story has ended. Beyond this threshold, the land unfurls across nearly 5,000 acres. It was once a private continent, a kingdom carved from the Colombian countryside, subject to one man's law. The landscape was sculpted by an imagination unburdened by limits, a place where fantasy was rendered in concrete and steel. Here, scattered across the overgrown fields, stand colossal figures of dinosaurs. A Tyrannosaurus rex, its concrete skin cracked and stained with mildew, roars silently at the sky. A Brontosaurus grazes on phantom leaves, its long neck a perch for tropical birds. They are relics of a manufactured prehistory, the absurd and expensive toys of a man who believed he could command time itself. These statues, once a source of wonder and intimidation, now appear as grotesque follies. They are monuments to a whim. Their scale and permanence a testament to the sheer volume of illicit cash that was funneled into this earth. Their decay mirrors that of the empire that birthed them, massive, unnatural, and slowly being consumed by the inevitable. But the most vital legacy of this manufactured world is not made of concrete. It moves through the waters of the estate's artificial lakes and has spread to the Magdalena River beyond. A small population of hippopotamuses, 4 of them illegally imported for a private zoo, has thrived and multiplied. They are an invasive species, a living, breathing ecological disaster, born from one man's desire to possess a piece of Africa. These animals, untethered from their creator's control, are perhaps the truest symbol of his impact. They are a chaotic, destructive force that has outlived the man and his cartel, a biological echo of a power that disregarded all natural and national boundaries. They wander the land as living ghosts of the estate's former glory. Further into the property lie the skeletal remains of the main house. It was once a sprawling Spanish colonial-style mansion, the nerve center from which a war was waged against a nation. Now it is a hollowed-out shell, its white walls pockmarked by the passage of time, treasure hunters, and the bullets of old enemies. The roof is gone in many places, allowing the sky to look down into rooms where billion-dollar deals were struck and assassinations were ordered. The window frames are empty sockets, like the eyes of a skull, staring out over a domain that has slipped from its grasp. Nature is an patient invader, with tree roots buckling the foundations and moss painting the stone in shades of green and grey. To walk through its empty halls is to move through an echo chamber. The sound of footsteps reverberates in the cavernous spaces, a stark contrast to the cacophony of parties and strategic summits that once filled them. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, decay, and the ghosts of extreme opulence. The walls bear the scars of a modern-day gold rush. After the empire fell, stories of hidden fortunes, of collators filled with millions in cash buried within the structure, drew looters from all over. They came with sledgehammers and drills, tearing into the plaster and concrete, searching for the mythic wealth of the world's most successful criminal. They found little, but their destructive search left the mansion's interior looking like a war zone, a frantic, failed autopsy performed on the corpse of a giant. Every broken tile and gouged wall is a testament to the enduring legend of the kingpin's buried treasure, a fortune so vast it was believed to be part of the architecture itself. This was the command center, the corporate headquarters of the Medellín Cartel. In these now desolate rooms, strategies were devised, routes were plotted, and betrayals were punished. The geography of the global drug trade was redrawn on maps laid out on tables that have long since vanished. The physical evidence of that power has been stripped away, leaving only the space it once occupied. It is a negative image of history, defined not by what is present, but by the overwhelming scale of what is absent. The silence is heavy with the weight of unspeakable conversations. Not far from the main house stands the private bullring. It was a stage for spectacle, where the owner could play the part of the grand Spanish patron, hosting corridas for his family and lieutenants. But it was also rumored to be a stage for a darker kind of theater, a place for ritualized executions and brutal assertions of dominance. Today, the sand of the arena is overgrown with weeds. The tiered seating crumbles, and the brightly painted barriers have faded to pastel shades. The place where life and death were a sport is now inert, a silent coliseum reclaimed by an indifferent landscape. It is a monument to a specific kind of cruelty, one that required an audience. The vast swimming pools, once shimmering oases of turquoise water, are now stagnant ponds. Their surfaces are slick with algae, their tiled bottoms cracked and covered in a sludge of rotting leaves. They were basins of pleasure and decadence, sites of legendary parties where loyalty was tested and allegiances were forged amidst excess. Their current state of putrescence feels symbolic. The clear, clean water of unimaginable luxury has transformed into a murky, fetid soup. It is a literal and metaphorical corruption, the decay of the dream made manifest in the very fixtures designed to celebrate it. Elsewhere, the charred skeletons of classic cars and motorcycles are slowly consumed by rust. They are the remains of a prized collection, incinerated not by time, but by the fury of rival cartels and paramilitary groups. The vehicles were a symbol of the owner's vanity, and their destruction was a calculated blow against his legacy. Their twisted metal frames are a stark reminder that this was not a peaceful kingdom that simply faded away. It was an empire dismantled by extreme violence, a war fought between factions for whom destruction was a primary language. The ashes of this collection mark a battlefield. The entire estate was conceived as a fortress, a bastion against a hostile world. It was surrounded by a private army, equipped with watchtowers, bunkers, and a sophisticated communications network. It was the physical manifestation of a profound paranoia, the architectural expression of a mind that saw enemies at every turn. That paranoia proved prophetic. The walls could not hold back the tide of retribution that was coming. The security systems were ultimately breached, not by a frontal assault, but by the slow, corrosive decay of the empire from within and the relentless pressure from without. Hacienda Nápoles was built to project an image of permanence, of a dynasty that would last for generations. Every structure, from the entrance gate to the private airstrip, was intended as a chapter in a myth the owner was writing for himself. He was not just building a home, he was building his own Versailles. It was a monument to the idea that enough money and enough ruthlessness could bend reality to one man's will. It was designed to be a self-contained universe, with its own laws, its own economy, and its own brand of justice, a place where a man could be king. Today the property stands as a powerful counter-narrative. It is a sprawling, chaotic museum of collapse. The theme park that now occupies a portion of the land cannot fully erase the ghosts. The laughter of children by a new waterslide cannot drown the echoes of the past. The ruin is not just a collection of decaying buildings. It is the material evidence of a failed claim to divinity. It demonstrates the profound vulnerability of power built on violence and fear. The concrete crumbles, the steel rusts, and the jungle always eventually returns. What remains is a landscape haunted by ambition. It is a testament to a man who amassed a fortune greater than that of many nations, yet whose ultimate desire for legitimacy and permanence resulted in this vast and telling wreckage. The story of the house is the story of the man, a spectacular rise followed by an even more spectacular fall. To understand the man, one must first understand the scale of his creation and the depth of its decay. For it was here, in this theater of excess, that Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria not only ran his empire but also built a monument to his own ego, a monument that would, in the end, become his tombstone. Before the concrete was poured, before the first exotic animal drew breath on Colombian soil, there was only the man. He was born Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, the son of a humble farmer and a schoolteacher, into a world that offered him no throne. His origins were unremarkable, rooted in the working-class soil of Antioquia, a region known for its industrious spirit and a long, complicated history with contraband. Nothing in his modest upbringing suggested the scale of the myth he would construct around himself. The Medellín of his youth was a city of sharp divides, a landscape of burgeoning industry and entrenched poverty, where ambition simmered in the narrow streets. It was a place where the lines between licit and illicit were porous, a frontier of opportunity for those willing to operate outside the established order. For a young man with a restless mind and a disdain for prescribed paths, the city was not a limitation but a training ground, a laboratory for a new kind of enterprise. His criminal career began not with a bang, but with the quiet scrape of stolen gravestones being sanded down for resale. It progressed to stolen cars and petty smuggling, each act a small-scale rehearsal for a grander performance. These early ventures were more than just a means to an end. They were an education in logistics, risk, and the subtle art of corrupting the systems meant to police him. He was learning that every rule had a price, and every official a vulnerability. Then came cocaine. It was a white powder that was rewriting the economies of desire in North America and Europe. While others saw a risky contraband, Escobar saw a commodity of historic potential, an engine for an empire that could rival corporations and challenge nations. He did not invent the trade, but he industrialized it, applying a brutal corporate logic to a clandestine business, transforming a cottage industry into a global machine. To understand the man, one must grasp his profound duality. In the barrios of Medellín, he cultivated the image of a benefactor, a Paisa Robin Hood who paved soccer fields, built housing for the destitute, and dispensed cash with the largesse of a benevolent king. This was not merely a cynical ploy for public support, it was a genuine facet of his identity, a deep-seated need to be loved and venerated by the people from whom he came. But beneath the veneer of popular hero lay the cold, unemotional core of a predator. His violence was not born of passion, but of calculation, a strategic tool wielded with surgical precision. The infamous choice he offered his enemies, plata o plomo, silver or lead, was the simple, terrifying mission statement of his entire operation. It was a philosophy that reduced all human interaction to a binary of cooperation or annihilation. His true obsession, however, was not with money itself, but with what it could not traditionally buy: legitimacy. He harbored a deep and corrosive resentment for Colombia's ruling class, the old money oligarchs of Bogotá and Medellín, who viewed him as nothing more than a vulgar upstart. Their exclusive clubs, their inherited political power, and their cultural prestige were doors slammed shut in his face, fueling a desire to not just join their world, but to build one that would render theirs obsolete. This was the psychological soil from which Hacienda Nápoles grew. It was conceived as a direct response to that rejection, an act of architectural warfare. If the elites had their refined country estates, he would build a sprawling continent of a ranch. If they prided themselves on their purebred horses, he would import elephants and rhinos. The estate was to be a monument to a new kind of power, one so immense and ostentatious that it could not be ignored or dismissed. The dream was megalomaniacal in its scope. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a figure of historical significance, a self-made emperor who deserved a palace befitting his station. The mansion would be his Versailles, a testament to his will, a place where he could write his own laws and shape reality to his liking. It was a project born from an ego that recognized no earthly limits. The sheer scale of the property, nearly 5,000 acres, was a statement in itself. It was not a purchase of land, but an act of sovereign claim. He was carving a new territory out of the Colombian countryside, a personal fiefdom where his authority was absolute. It was a place large enough to contain not just a home, but the entirety of his fantasies, a kingdom built on a foundation of illicit profits. The location in Puerto Triunfo was strategic, nestled between the country's two largest cities, yet remote enough to feel like a separate world. The hot, humid climate of the Magdalena Medio Valley was a blank canvas, a wild and untamed landscape that he could domesticate and reshape. The act of taming the jungle was a metaphor for his own ascent, imposing his will upon a chaotic world. This project would give birth to a new aesthetic, a style that would later be dubbed narco-aesthetics. It was an architecture of excess, unconcerned with subtlety or classical proportion. Its primary goal was to overwhelm, to stun the visitor with a spectacle of wealth so profound it bordered on the surreal. It was the material language of a man who had more money than he could ever spend, and a desperate need for everyone to know it. Yet from its very inception, the design was infused with a deep-seated paranoia. Even as he dreamed of a paradise, he was planning for a siege. The estate was conceived as a fortress, a sanctuary that could repel the outside world he sought to dominate. Every opulent feature was to be matched by a hidden security measure, every open vista monitored by unseen eyes. Hacienda Nápoles was therefore destined to be a paradox. It was a stage for displaying his power to the world, and a bunker for hiding from its consequences. It was a monument to his public image and a secret headquarters for his criminal enterprise. The sprawling grounds designed for leisure and spectacle would double as a buffer zone, a deadly perimeter against his ever-growing list of enemies. The vision was total. It was not enough to have a big house. He needed a universe of his own making. The private zoo, the dinosaur park, the collection of classic cars, these were not the hobbies of a rich man. They were the actions of a creator, a man populating his own world with the creatures and artifacts of his choosing, asserting a power that reached beyond the human realm and into the domain of history and nature. Thus, long before the first foundation was dug, the mansion was already built in the architecture of his mind. It was to be the physical manifestation of his psyche, a complex structure of towering ambition, profound insecurity, and a bottomless hunger for a legitimacy that would forever remain beyond his grasp. The cement would be mixed with cocaine and blood, creating a monument as grand and as flawed as its creator. The rise of the empire was not chronicled in ledgers or corporate reports, but in cubic meters of concrete and acres of sculpted land. As cocaine profits surged from a torrent into a biblical flood, the earth at Puerto Triunfo began to transform. Hacienda Nápoles was not built, it was unleashed, a physical manifestation of a fortune too vast and too illicit to be contained by conventional means. Every brick laid was a dollar laundered, every new wing a testament to a successfully completed shipment. The architectural style chosen was a deliberate fiction. A sprawling Spanish colonial facade, with its white stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and graceful archways, was meant to evoke a sense of old-world legitimacy, of established landed gentry. It was a mask of heritage for a man who had none, a carefully constructed lie intended to cloak the brutal modernity of his enterprise. The house was designed to look like it had always been there, a timeless estate rather than the freshly minted headquarters of a global criminal syndicate. But this was no traditional hacienda. It was an architecture of pure assertion, a style later defined as narco-aesthetics. It disregarded subtlety, proportion, and taste in favor of overwhelming scale and spectacle. The goal was not to charm, but to stun, to create a sense of disorientation in the visitor, a feeling that they had crossed a threshold into a reality governed by different laws. The mansion grew erratically, its wings expanding not according to a master plan, but in response to the owner's shifting whims and escalating profits. This sprawling complex was a weapon of psychological warfare. To be summoned to Nápoles was to be subjected to an overwhelming display of power. Guests would traverse miles of private roads, past imported exotic beasts grazing in manufactured savannas, before the main house even came into view. The journey itself was a process of intimidation, designed to diminish the visitor and establish the absolute sovereignty of its owner before a single word was exchanged. The interior was a labyrinth of excess. Rooms were vast, ceilings soared, and every surface was a testament to wealth untethered from restraint. Marble floors were polished to a mirror shine. reflecting gilded fixtures and imported chandeliers. Yet, beneath this veneer of opulence, the house functioned with the cold efficiency of a corporate headquarters. Hidden offices were equipped with sophisticated communications technology, connecting this remote jungle outpost to the financial centers and drug markets of the world. The property became a living canvas for its creator's megalomania. The decision to construct a private zoo was perhaps the most potent expression of his power. It was not the act of an animal lover, but of a conqueror. He illegally imported elephants, giraffes, rhinoceroses, and hippopotamuses, smuggling an entire ecosystem across continents. This act defied international treaties and biological reality, a declaration that his will superseded the laws of nations and even the laws of nature. Further into the estate, another fantasy took shape in reinforced concrete, a park of life-sized dinosaurs. A Tyrannosaurus rex roared silently over an artificial lake, its scale a grotesque monument to a whim. These prehistoric behemoths served no practical purpose. They were pure symbols. They represented a man who saw himself as a force of nature, a figure of mythic proportions who could not only reshape the present, but also resurrect the past and populate his world with its most formidable creatures. The mansion was also a museum of his victories. A prized collection of classic and luxury cars was housed in dedicated garages, each vehicle a trophy. They were not merely for transportation, but for display, tangible proof of his success. The collection told a story of conquest, of an ascent from the streets of Medellín to a position where he could acquire the very symbols of wealth once exclusive to the oligarchs he despised. But for all its outward-facing spectacle, the house was fundamentally a fortress, a psychological bunker against a world of enemies. Its design was saturated with a deep and abiding paranoia. The sprawling grounds were not just for recreation, they were a kill zone, a vast buffer that made any surprise assault nearly impossible. The idyllic landscape was a carefully engineered defensive perimeter. Hidden from view, a network of security infrastructure was woven into the estate's fabric. Watchtowers were discreetly integrated into the architecture. Underground bunkers, stocked with weapons and supplies, offered refuge in the event of a siege. Secret passages were rumored to connect different parts of the main house, allowing for escape or clandestine movement. The paradise was built upon the constant, gnawing fear of its own destruction. Nápoles was, therefore, a paradox. It was a stage designed for an audience and a sanctuary designed to keep the world out. It was a declaration of invincibility and a physical manifestation of profound vulnerability. Every opulent guest suite had its counterpart in a reinforced panic room. Every scenic vista was monitored by unseen guards, armed with automatic weapons. The house was a gilded cage, its luxury inseparable from the threat that necessitated its defenses. The estate became the nerve center of the Medellín Cartel. In its opulent conference rooms, surrounded by priceless art and exotic animal heads, the strategies of a global narcotics empire were forged. Maps were spread across massive tables, charting new smuggling routes through the Caribbean. Lists of politicians, judges, and police officers were drawn up, each name to be met with a choice: silver or lead. The legendary parties at Nápoles were not frivolous affairs, they were instruments of control. They served as loyalty tests where attendance was mandatory and behavior was scrutinized. Amidst the music, food, and endless flow of champagne, hierarchies were reinforced, intelligence was gathered, and betrayals were sniffed out. The festive atmosphere was a thin mask over a tense and unforgiving court, where a wrong word could be a death sentence. The house itself became a silent accomplice in these proceedings. Its thick walls absorbed the whispers of conspiracies and the echoes of death sentences. Its labyrinthine corridors held the secrets of alliances and betrayals. The very ground was rumored to be a repository for the empire's sins, with stories circulating of bodies buried in the vast gardens and collators of blood money hidden within the structure itself. It was more than a command post. It was a tool of seduction. Inviting a journalist or a politician to the estate was a calculated move to overwhelm their moral compass. The sheer spectacle of the place, the casual display of impossible wealth, was designed to corrupt, to make complicity seem not only profitable but logical. It presented a world where the normal rules of society were suspended. The mansion was also a refuge from the psychological toll of its owner's life. Within its fortified perimeter, he could construct a fantasy of normalcy. He could be a benevolent patriarch, doting on his family, surrounded by the laughter of his children. The zoo and the theme park were not just for his guests, they were for him, a way to create a bubble of innocence in the heart of a violent enterprise. This duality defined the property's existence. It was both a family home and a war room, a playground and a graveyard. The same swimming pools that hosted children's birthday parties were the sites of tense meetings between sicarios and their commanders. The tranquil surface of the artificial lakes belied their potential use as a final resting place for the disloyal. The concrete and steel of Hacienda Nápoles were therefore infused with the very essence of the empire it served. It was a structure built of contradiction, of populist charm and sociopathic brutality, of a desire for public adoration and a need for absolute secrecy, of unimaginable luxury and crippling paranoia. The house was a direct reflection of its creator's mind. Every architectural choice was a strategic decision. The single, heavily guarded entrance road ensured total control over who came and went. The private airstrip allowed for the seamless movement of associates, cash, and contraband, placing the estate beyond the reach of state authorities. The property did not just occupy the land, it annexed it, functioning as a de facto sovereign territory. As the empire grew, so did the mansion, each new addition a physical marker of its expanding power. A new wing might be funded by the successful establishment of a new trafficking route into Miami. The acquisition of a rare rhinoceros might celebrate the elimination of a rival. The house was a living balance sheet of the cartel's fortunes, written in a language of extravagance and concrete. What, then, was the ultimate purpose of this sprawling monument? Was it a weapon to intimidate enemies, a mask to disguise a criminal enterprise as a legitimate estate, or a refuge to shield a paranoid king from the world he had set on fire? Perhaps its true genius lay in being all of these things at once. But in the architecture of vanity, one element often speaks louder than the rest. What single feature of this vast and complex creation, the audacious gate, the impossible zoo, the labyrinthine mansion itself, best captures the sheer limitless ego of the man who built it? At its zenith, the empire was a logistical miracle of corruption. Its greatest challenge was not the production of its commodity, nor its clandestine delivery across borders, but the sheer physical weight of its success. The profits returned not as wire transfers or abstract figures on a ledger, but as mountains of paper currency, a biblical flood of American dollars that threatened to drown its beneficiaries in the very proof of their crimes. This was wealth as a physical problem, a crisis of volume that demanded an industrial solution. A river of cash, bundled in plastic and packed into suitcases, flowed south. It traveled in the hulls of cargo ships, the baggage compartments of commercial airliners, and the custom-fitted panels of private jets. The risk of seizure was immense, but the volume was too great to be managed any other way. For every $10 million that made it back to Colombia, another million might be lost to rot, water damage, or the simple inability to count it fast enough. This raw currency was a liability, a contaminant. It had to be cleansed, transformed from evidence of a crime into the legitimate assets of a corporation. The process of laundering began locally, a network of small streams feeding a larger ocean. Fleets of taxis, corner stores, and construction companies became the first filters, their daily cash deposits subtly inflated with illicit earnings, turning drug money into bus fares and bags of cement. On a grander scale, a constellation of front companies gave the empire a legitimate face. Real estate holdings absorbed hundreds of millions, turning vacant lots into high-rise buildings. Professional soccer teams provided a perfect vehicle for washing money through inflated ticket sales and falsified player transfers, all while stoking the public adoration so desperately craved by the empire's ruler. The passion of the masses became another financial instrument, but the Colombian economy was merely the first rinse cycle. To truly legitimize the fortune, it had to be integrated into the global financial system. A complex web of shell corporations and bank accounts was established in jurisdictions with pliable banking laws. Panama, the Cayman Islands, And Switzerland became essential nodes in this network, their institutional silence purchased with a fraction of the sums they helped conceal. This financial architecture required a parallel structure of human complicity. It was not enough to own banks. One had to own the people who regulated them, the police who investigated them, and the judges who presided over them. The empire's operating philosophy was brutally simple, a binary code of coercion that reduced all human interaction to a single choice: accept the silver or face the lead. This was not mere bribery, it was the systematic colonization of the state. Entire precincts of police officers, courtrooms full of judges, and wings of the National Congress were placed on the cartel's payroll. They were not just turning a blind eye. They were active participants, providing intelligence, logistical support, and a shield of impunity that rendered the official government powerless. From the quiet, air-conditioned offices within Hacienda Nápoles, a state within a state was administered. It had its own foreign policy, its own intelligence service, and its own system of justice, which was swifter and more absolute than any offered by the official judiciary. The mansion was no longer just a property. It was a capital building, the seat of a shadow government whose authority was written in blood and backed by an inexhaustible treasury. The decisions made within its walls had more tangible impact on the nation than the laws debated in Bogotá. A command whispered into a telephone from a leather armchair in the mansion's study could ground flights, close ports, and trigger a wave of assassinations that would bring the country to a standstill. The house had become the epicenter of a sovereign power that openly challenged the legitimacy of the nation it occupied. Inside, the mansion was now complete, a living, breathing organism at the peak of its operational power. The facade it presented to the world was one of endless leisure, guests lounging by the turquoise pools, children marveling at the concrete dinosaurs, and the sound of music drifting across the manicured lawns. It was a carefully curated illusion of a peaceful, prosperous kingdom. But behind unmarked doors, down corridors forbidden to all but the most trusted lieutenants, lay the true engine room of the empire. These were not opulent chambers, but functional, sterile spaces buzzing with the technology of a multinational corporation. Here, the romance of the outlaw vanished, replaced by the cold calculus of global logistics. In these hidden offices, telex machines chattered incessantly, relaying encrypted shipping manifests and financial instructions. Banks of high-frequency radios connected the remote jungle estate to pilots and boat captains navigating the Caribbean. Satellite phones, a rare and expensive technology at the time, offered a direct, secure line to brokers in Zurich and partners in Miami, turning the geographic isolation of the hacienda into a strategic asset. The master of the house would move between these two worlds with seamless fluidity. He could be seen one moment playing with his children by the zoo, and the next, he would disappear into a soundproofed room to authorize the execution of a disloyal associate, or review a balance sheet detailing the weekly profits from the streets of Los Angeles. The mansion was the stage that allowed him to perform both roles, benevolent patriarch and ruthless chief executive. The legendary fiestas held at Nápoles were the empire's most elaborate board meetings. Beneath the fireworks and the performances by international music stars, hierarchies were reinforced, loyalties were tested, and information was exchanged in coded whispers. A promotion might be granted with the gift of a gold watch. A death sentence could be sealed with a cold stare from across a crowded room. Beneath the surface of forced revelry, a current of intense scrutiny ran through every interaction. The host observed everything, his mind a quiet ledger of debts and transgressions. The parties were a tool of control, a way to gather his vassals under one roof, where their behavior could be monitored and their allegiance measured. The price of admission was absolute loyalty. The penalty for failure was to disappear before the sun rose. The reign was absolute. The mansion stood as a monument to a victory so complete it seemed eternal. The state was cowed, rivals were eliminated or subjugated, and the flow of money was a self-perpetuating deluge. He had achieved a level of power that few figures in history, legitimate or otherwise, had ever known. He was untouchable, yet the walls built to keep enemies out now served to lock its master in. The absolute control he wielded over his environment, fostered a profound and corrosive paranoia. The fortress had become a prison, its sprawling grounds a gilded cage. The more power he consolidated within the mansion, the more dangerous the world outside its gates seemed to be. He began to see betrayal in the eyes of his oldest friends. Every servant was a potential informant for the DEA, every guest a potential assassin sent by a rival. The security apparatus he had built to protect himself now seemed to exist primarily to watch his own people, creating an atmosphere of suffocating distrust that permeated the very air of the estate. The vast picture windows, designed to offer commanding views of the kingdom he had built, now seemed to invite the gaze of unseen snipers. The open, rolling hills that once represented his dominion over the landscape now appeared as a perfect field of fire for an invading force. The architecture of triumph was slowly morphing into a blueprint of vulnerability. The silence in the mansion between parties grew heavier, filled not with peace but with the hum of surveillance equipment and the owner's own circular thoughts. He would wander the empty, cavernous halls at night, a solitary king in a palace built for a cast of thousands, his footsteps echoing in the opulent void. The exotic animals in his private zoo seemed to be the only living things he could truly trust. He had built a world unto himself, a 5,000-acre kingdom of perfect control, insulated from the laws and consequences of the outside world. He had succeeded beyond the wildest imaginings of the boy from the hard streets of Medellín. But in doing so, he had discovered the ultimate paradox of absolute power. He was its sole, permanent prisoner, besieged not by armies, but by the architecture of his own success. For a time, the fortress seemed to have conquered history. Hacienda Nápoles stood at the apex of its power, a self-contained universe operating under its own laws of physics, where money bent reality and violence was a form of gravity. The empire it commanded felt permanent, its foundations sunk so deep into the bedrock of corruption that they appeared unshakable. But in the architecture of power, the most catastrophic failures often begin not with a seismic shock, but with a hairline crack, invisible to all but the most discerning eye. The first fissure was not caused by an external force, but by a flaw in the creator's own design. It was an error born of his deepest psychological need, the craving for legitimacy. The decision to step out from the lucrative shadows and into the harsh glare of Colombian politics was an act of supreme vanity. By winning a seat as an alternate congressman, he believed he could launder his own identity, transforming himself from a criminal into a statesman. Instead, he simply painted a target on his own back. The public unmasking was swift and brutal. In the hallowed halls of the Colombian Congress, a political enemy, the newly appointed Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, held up an old newspaper clipping. It showed a younger, less powerful Pablo Escobar, his face sullen in a police mugshot from a long-forgotten arrest. In that single televised moment, the carefully constructed persona of the benevolent populist shattered, exposing the crude reality of the narco-trafficker beneath. The response was not a political maneuver, but a reflex of the underworld. The assassination of Lara Bonilla on a Bogotá street in April 1984 was an act of pure, calculated fury. It was meant as a final, silencing statement, a demonstration that no one could challenge the empire and survive. But it was a profound miscalculation. The gunshot that killed the minister was a starting gun for a war the kingpin could not win. It was the first time his violence had provoked not fear, but a unified national resolve. The state, so long paralyzed by corruption and intimidation, finally stirred. The assassination crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, forcing the government's hand. The previously unthinkable policy of extraditing Colombian nationals to the United States was approved. Suddenly, the most terrifying specter in Escobar's world became a legal reality. American justice, a force beyond the reach of his silver or his lead, was now a tangible threat. The shockwaves reached the gates of Hacienda Nápoles. The estate, once a sanctuary beyond the grasp of the law, suffered its first violation. Colombian special forces, in a series of raids, breached the perimeter. While they found little of substance, the psychological damage was immense. The sanctity of the kingdom had been broken. The walls, once symbols of absolute power, now felt porous, vulnerable. The world was no longer being held at bay. Rather than retreat, the empire doubled down on its founding principle. The response to the state's offensive was a declaration of total war. This was a strategic shift from clandestine crime to open narco-terrorism. The violence, once targeted and strategic, became public and indiscriminate, designed to terrorize the civilian population and bring the government to its knees. Car bombs began to tear through the urban fabric of Bogotá and Medellín, turning city squares into battlefields. The campaign of terror reached its apex with the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán in 1989. Galán was the leading presidential candidate, a man of immense popularity whose entire platform was built on an uncompromising stance against the cartels and a firm commitment to extradition. His murder in front of thousands at a public rally was an attack on the very heart of Colombian democracy. It was an act so audacious, it left no room for negotiation or retreat. This act galvanized a new and formidable enemy, the United States government, which had viewed the drug trade as a distant law enforcement problem, now saw it as a national security threat personified by a single man. A torrent of American resources, DEA intelligence, satellite surveillance, military training, and funding began to flow into Colombia, arming the state for a new kind of war. The fight was no longer local, it had become a global manhunt. Simultaneously, the empire began to rot from within. The immense pressure of a two-front war against the state and a superpower began to fracture the monolithic structure of the Medellín Cartel. The old alliances, forged in the camaraderie of shared risk and spectacular profit, began to buckle. Partners who had ridden the wave of success now saw only a suicidal endgame, whispering of negotiated surrenders that their leader, in his megalomania, refused to consider. A new, more cunning enemy also saw its opportunity. The rival Cali cartel, which had long operated in Medellín's shadow with a more corporate, low-profile strategy, began to actively work against Escobar. They saw that his war against the state could be their path to market dominance. They quietly began feeding intelligence to the authorities, directing the government's war machine toward their primary competitor. Escobar's paranoia, once a finely tuned instrument of survival, became a blunt weapon of self-destruction. He saw betrayal everywhere, in the faces of his oldest and most loyal associates. He began to purge his own organization, torturing and executing men who had built the empire alongside him, often on nothing more than a whispered rumor. Each execution created a new cell of silent, vengeful enemies. From these ashes of internal purges, the most lethal threat emerged: Los Pepes, a Spanish acronym for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This was not a police force or a rival cartel, but a paramilitary death squad with a singular mission of vengeance. It was a coalition of the damned, funded by the Cali cartel and staffed by the very men Escobar had trained, betrayed, and terrorized. They knew his methods, his networks, and his secrets. Los Pepes did not seek to arrest him. They sought to annihilate his world. They mirrored his own tactics with a terrifying symmetry, targeting his lawyers, his financial managers, and most cruelly, his extended family. They did not adhere to rules of engagement or concern themselves with collateral damage. They waged a war of extermination, paying him back in his own currency of brutality. Hacienda Nápoles, the ultimate symbol of his invincibility, became a primary target. Its sprawling, isolated grounds, once a defensive asset, were now a liability. Los Pepes launched attacks on the estate, not to seize it, but to desecrate it. They torched his prized collection of classic cars, turning millions of dollars of automotive history into blackened, twisted metal. The fortress was being scarred, not by the state, but by the ghosts of his own creation. The king was now a prisoner inside his own palace. The vast, opulent rooms of the mansion, once stages for lavish parties, became echo chambers of his growing isolation. He moved through the gilded halls like a phantom, surrounded by an ever-shrinking circle of guards whose loyalty he questioned with every passing moment. The paradise he had built had become a claustrophobic trap, the walls closing in. The illusion of effortless control was gone, replaced by the frantic, desperate improvisation of a losing battle. The empire's vast resources were no longer channeled into expansion or fantasy projects. but were consumed by the furnace of a multi-front war. The primary business was no longer trafficking, it was survival, a daily struggle to plug the leaks in a structure that was failing everywhere at once. The cracks were now visible on the white stucco facade of the great house. They ran deep into the foundations, spiderwebbing through the concrete and the myth of the man who built it. The structure still stood magnificent and defiant against the jungle sky, but it was a hollowed-out thing. The rain was over. All that remained was the slow, inexorable process of collapse. The final act of defiance was not a battle, but a walk. When Pablo Escobar strolled out of La Catedral, the luxurious prison he had built for himself, he was not merely escaping custody. He was shedding the last illusion of his own invincibility. It was a final, contemptuous gesture aimed at a state he had brought to its knees, but it was also a fatal strategic error. In becoming a fugitive, he untethered himself from the very source of his power, his infrastructure. He was no longer a king in his castle, but a ghost on the run. His true kingdom, Hacienda Nápoles, was now an empty throne room. The private army that had once made it an impenetrable fortress dwindled, its soldiers melting back into the countryside, drawn away by fear or the promise of payment from new masters. The estate, left without its sovereign, became a ghost ship, adrift and undefended, a vast and tempting prize for the wolves that were now circling. The war for his destruction had become a holy crusade. The Colombian state, armed and guided by American intelligence, assembled the search bloc, an elite force with a single mandate, to hunt one man to the ends of the earth. But another, darker force was also unleashed. Los Pepes, the vigilante army of his own victims and betrayed associates, began its own campaign, one unbound by law or morality. They did not want to capture him. They wanted to erase him. Their war was not fought in the halls of justice, but on the symbolic battlefield of his legacy. And the greatest symbol of all was Nápoles. The first assault was not a police raid, but a desecration. Under the cover of darkness, members of Los Pepes breached the perimeter of the abandoned estate. They did not come to seize territory, but to commit a ritualistic act of vengeance. They moved past the silent concrete dinosaurs and the empty cages of the zoo, their target a small, unassuming garage. Inside sat the heart of his vanity, the prized collection of vintage automobiles. With gasoline and fire, they turned a fortune in classic cars into a pyre. The flames that consumed the collection were a message, a declaration that they would not just dismantle his empire, but burn its very memory to the ground. Then came the state. The official reclamation of Hacienda Nápoles began not with a ground assault, but from the air. The percussive thud of Black Hawk helicopter blades tore through the humid morning quiet, a sound the estate had not heard since its master ruled the skies. They descended upon the manicured lawns like birds of prey, disgorging dozens of heavily armed commandos from the search block. There was no resistance. The gates that had once held back the world were now undefended. The soldiers moved with tactical precision through a landscape of surreal decay. They swept past the algae-choked swimming pools and the grand, silent bull ring, their modern weaponry a stark contrast to the kitsch and fantasy of the surroundings. They were invading a dream, and they found it already turning into a nightmare. Breaching the main house was an anticlimax. The heavy doors were unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of abandonment. A fine layer of dust had begun to settle on the marble floors and gilded furniture, a slow, inexorable burial. The vast echoing halls, once filled with the cacophony of power and celebration, were now utterly silent, save for the crunch of tactical boots on forgotten debris. The mansion had ceased to be a home. It was now officially a crime scene. The agents moved from room to room, their search methodical and impersonal. They were not looking for a man, but for the ghost of his enterprise. They peeled back expensive paintings to check for hidden safes, tapped on walls listening for the hollow sound of a hidden compartment, and catalogued every stray document left behind. They found the mundane architecture of a global corporation. In hidden offices, they discovered ledgers, shipping manifests, and lists of contacts that read like a directory of the nation's corrupted soul. The evidence was not in dramatic caches of weapons, but in the banal paperwork of a multinational business whose product was poison. The cold, hard proof of the empire was less spectacular than its myth. The house itself became the primary subject of the investigation. It was no longer a symbol of power, but a container of secrets. Every wall, every floorboard, every square inch of its vast territory was now suspect. The authorities began a slow, painstaking autopsy on the structure, believing the true fortune, the billions in buried cash known as calitas, was part of the architecture itself. This official search soon gave way to a frenzied, chaotic treasure hunt. News of the abandoned palace and its rumored hidden fortunes spread like a virus. Looters, from desperate locals to organized gangs, descended upon the property. They came with shovels, pickaxes, and sledgehammers, driven by the enduring myth of the kingpin's wealth. The mansion was subjected to a final, brutal violation. The looters tore into its body with a desperate fury, ripping out bathroom fixtures, smashing through ornate plaster walls, and digging up the manicured gardens. The search for buried gold turned the palace into a war zone, its interior gutted not by an invading army, but by the greed its former owner had so expertly cultivated. The physical structure began to mirror the state of the empire it once represented, hollowed out, fractured, and picked clean by scavengers. The white stucco walls were pockmarked with crude holes, the elegant floors were shattered, and the soul of the place was systematically ripped out in the frantic search for a treasure that was mostly legend. Eventually, the Colombian state formalized its victory. Through a process of asset forfeiture, the government officially seized Hacienda Nápoles. A legal decree was the final bullet, transferring ownership of the nearly 5,000-acre kingdom from the world's most powerful criminal to the nation he had tried to destroy. The property was no longer a personal fiefdom. It was a spoil of war. The gates were chained and sealed, this time with the authority of the state. The remaining animals in the zoo were relocated, their confused cries echoing a final sad farewell to their creator's bizarre fantasy. The house, now a violated shell, was left to the silence and the encroaching jungle, a monument stripped of its power, its purpose, and its master. The ruin was now complete. The fortress had fallen not to a single decisive battle, but to a slow, agonizing siege from all sides. It was raided by the law, desecrated by its enemies, and cannibalized by the myth of its own hidden wealth. The power that had once seemed as solid as the concrete of its foundations had evaporated, leaving behind only the husk of a colossal ambition. But does true power reside in what is built, in the stone and steel that can be seized and broken? Or is it something more intangible, a force that survives long after the walls have crumbled to dust? The answer may lie in what happens when a kingdom is finally erased from the map. If you find yourself questioning the nature of power, subscribe to our channel to explore more stories of empires that were built to last forever, and the inevitable forces that brought them to ruin. The man who built the kingdom did not die within its walls. His end came on a sloped tile roof in a middle-class Medellín neighborhood, a final, desperate scramble under an unforgiving sky. He was a fugitive king, stripped of his palace, his army, and the myth of his own divinity. The empire collapsed not in a grand final battle at its fortress, but in a brief, brutal exchange of gunfire in a city that was both his cradle and his grave. With its master gone, Hacienda Nápoles entered a long, silent purgatory. The state, having conquered the territory, seemed unsure of what to do with its prize. The estate became a national liability, a 5,000-acre symbol of a past too toxic to memorialize and too vast to erase. For over a decade, it was left to the quiet judgment of time, a ghost ship of an empire run aground in the Colombian tropics. Nature became its patient caretaker. The jungle, which had been brutally tamed, began its slow, inexorable reclamation. Green tendrils crept over the concrete skin of the dinosaurs, their silent roars now muffled by moss and vines. The turquoise swimming pools turned into stagnant, murky ponds, breeding grounds for insects. The air, once thick with the scent of expensive perfume and gunpowder, now carried only the smell of damp earth and decay. The mansion itself suffered a final, intimate violation. It was cannibalized by the very legend it had helped create. Treasure hunters, possessed by the myth of buried fortunes, descended upon the hollowed structure. They tore into its walls with sledgehammers and drills, ripping up floors and dismantling fixtures in a frantic, fruitless search for hidden cash. The house was not just looted, it was autopsied by greed. Then came the strangest of resurrections. The heart of the narco-state, the epicenter of a national trauma, was leased to a private entity and reborn as a family theme park. The ultimate irony was rendered in concrete and commerce. The grounds that had once served as a theater for terror were repurposed for leisure, with water slides and safari tours built upon the ashes of a criminal enterprise. The ruins of the main house were preserved, cordoned off like an archaeological curiosity. The skeletal remains of the mansion now stand as a sanitized exhibit, a historical footnote in a landscape of manufactured fun. The bullring, once a stage for private cruelties, is just another stop on a tourist map. The symbols of absolute power were defanged, turned into a backdrop for vacation photographs. But one part of the legacy could not be contained by fences or rebranded for tourism. The 4 hippopotamuses, imported as a casual display of omnipotence, had survived their creator. In the fertile wetlands of the Magdalena River Valley, they thrived, multiplied, and escaped. They became a biological echo of the empire itself, invasive, destructive, and beyond the control of any authority. These animals are now the truest living monument to the man and his creation. They wander the Colombian countryside as a chaotic, unpredictable force, an ecological disaster born from a criminal's whim. They are a more enduring testament to his impact than any crumbling building, a living metaphor for a power that disregarded all natural boundaries and left behind a problem with no simple solution. The man had sought permanence. He built in concrete and steel, believing he could erect a dynasty that would outlast his enemies and legitimize his name. What remains is a commercialized spectacle haunted by its own history and a herd of wild hippos forever altering an ecosystem. The legacy is not one of order and control, but of persistent, untamable chaos. The entrance gate still stands, the small replica plane perched atop it, its paint peeling away to reveal the corroding metal beneath. It once symbolized the beginning of an audacious ascent, the first chapter in a myth of self-creation. Today, it marks the point of origin for a spectacular collapse. It is no longer a monument to a first shipment, but a gravestone marking a final, disastrous destination. The property has become a landscape of contradiction, a place where the laughter of children mingles with the ghosts of unspeakable acts. The ruins do not speak of a fallen king's glory, but of the profound fragility of power built on violence. They are a testament to the idea that the grander the ambition, the more grotesque and telling the wreckage it leaves behind. When an empire built to defy all laws finally collapses under the weight of its own hubris, what truly endures in its wake? Is it the memory of the power it once wielded, or the permanent, ineradicable scar of the damage it caused? If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.